welcome to Literary Prospects, where we talk to authors and literary professionals about books, publishing, and the writing life. I'm Kelley Vick. I'm the host of the program, and in just a moment, it will be my pleasure to introduce today's guest. But first, a reminder that if you like what you hear, please do take a moment to subscribe. It helps us out, and you can make sure you never miss an episode. Also, we've opened a Literary Prospects shop, so if you're looking for bookish shirts, totes, and gifts, please check that out at literaryprospects.etsy.com. And to grab books featured on the podcast and check out more curated book lists, you can visit the Literary Prospects bookstore on bookshop.org. We'll leave all those links below in the show notes. And now, let's introduce today's guest. Sara Reish Desmond grew up in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. She earned a BA in English from Kenyon College and her MFA in fiction from Vermont College of Fine Arts. Her work has appeared in the Los Angeles Review, the Kenyon Review, and Waterstone Review, among other publications, and her short stories have been finalists for the Rick DeMoranis Short Story Prize and the Copper Nickel Award. Her debut story collection, What We Might Become, is out now from Cornerstone Press. Sara teaches and lives just north of Boston with her husband and 2 daughters. Sara Reish Desmond, thank you so much for joining today. I am thrilled to talk with you about your debut story collection, What We Might Become. Author Robin MacArthur says, I will return to these haunting, perfect stories and their evocative landscapes again and again. Author Steve Yarborough says, these stories are vivid and taut, and one of Desmond's great virtues is that she doesn't get in the way of her characters. She lets them breathe. Author Nima Vashia says, you will not shake these stories easily. And author Jess Rowe says, the cadence of the sentences, the probing, unsettling voice of her narrators, and the dark conclusions she reaches about the underside of contemporary American life. Desmond writes with quiet fury. Anyone who loves short stories will want to own this one. So with that, what can you tell us about What We Might Become? How would you describe the collection?
They've done such a nice job of illuminating such different aspects of the collection in ways that are really, they're surprising to me in a way, because I do conceive of the collection. I feel like every reader brings something new to their interpretation of the collection. And that's one of the things that I've been so surprised by and so adore about having the book out in the world now, is that when I speak with groups and people like yourselves, they're always bringing some new element that, that feels much more subconscious than overt. And I love those discoveries. And I think, I think those are beautiful descriptions of what I'm trying to do there. But I think the way that I would describe it is that I really conceived of this as a collection about people at the threshold or threshold experiences, liminal characters. Most distinctly, like there are a ton of adolescents in the collection, and I love adolescents. I actually have 2 adolescents now. But there's something so very unique about the adolescent experience, the teenage experience. They are neither children nor adults yet, and that they are squarely and firmly developmentally and psychologically in that liminal space. But then there are other liminal characters in this collection, like, an expecting mother, a wounded veteran returning home from war, a new widower. These are all, examples of characters who are kind of in uniquely transitional moments of their lives. And if not in a transitional moment of their lives, they're in transitional circumstances or experiences like loss of virginity, for instance, things of that nature. So I think what I was really thinking about was kind of binding the collection together, was this idea of transitional moments, and came to it kind of with a deep curiosity about how we are asked to respond and how we choose to respond in those moments. And I'm fascinated by that as a writer and a person.
Yeah. What is it? Can you talk a little more about what is it that fascinates you about this sort of in between? This in between of adolescence, this in between of grief,
I
these
think there's so
transitional.
much potential, right? I think
Mhm.
it's about the possibility of it all and the potential of it. I like that you mentioned, grief there. That's something that, I think Robin specifically, MacArthur, she really kind of viewed this collection of short stories through the grief lens very much. I am entirely fascinated by grief and a little obsessed with it, I'll say. I think any good writing is coming from a place of like deep curiosity and obsession, maybe.
Mhm.
And so I think like grief is a liminal state, absolutely, right? And
Mhm.
in those, for instance, in a grief state, there's this kind of lack of expectation around it. It can, it can render a person entirely crippled by the state. It can have this kind of, ecstatic capability, and I think that's true for all kind of. I mean, the teenage experience in particular, right, is just ripe with possibility and potential. And so I
Mhm.
think drilling down into individual characters like that um, allows me so much liberty as a writer to explore what those potentialities are, and it allows me to kind of make unexpected choices, and I like doing that in my work, thinking about what's the least likely outcome here, or what's the thing that pushes the narrator or the narrative in a certain direction, but that
Mhm.
still remains authentic to the character arc or the trajectory of that character in that moment.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm so interested in liminal spaces or threshold characters and experiences. Yeah.
What is it about the short form
Hmm.
that you like?
I think the short form is so hard. It's so very hard. I did. I've written these stories over like a really long period of time. So, the first story in this collection, not Clay Girls is the first story in the collection, but it is a story that I drafted during my MFA, and that is very much in the rearview mirror. I was pregnant with my oldest daughter when I went to Vermont College of Fine Arts to get my MFA. She's 16 now,
Wow.
so that's a really it's an old story, right?
Mhm.
But very much prescient anyway. But old in terms of the drafting process of it all. And many of these have kind of been um, written alongside other projects and things. The youngest story in the collection is like 2 years old. I wrote it in the fall of 2022. But I think, to answer your question, what I like about the form itself is that it feels like a riddle, a little bit like a puzzle. I
Mhm.
oftentimes think about. I usually have some inciting incident or a character that I'm fascinated with, or um, a scenario that I'm trying to work out, and I know where I'm starting, and I oftentimes know where I'm headed, where the like landing spot is,
Mhm.
but I don't always know how to get there. And I guess in that way, I'm a bit of a pantser, not a plotter.
Mhm.
I do not storyboard. I'm not prescriptive about my scene work. Um, and to me, it's about like kind of finding the authentic voice and then kind of following that character along from point A to point B to that natural conclusion.
Mhm.
That's what's so inspiring to me about a short story. To me, is that it feels like kind of like a big puzzle to be solved. There's such great satisfaction in the solution of that.
Yeah.
And sometimes they don't come, and then you have to abandon that story, right? but to me, that has something. That's the cachet. Is the solving of the puzzle.
How do you know when it's done? Because we can revise and revise, and especially in the short form as well, where do you say, okay, I'm stopping it here? Like, how do you know when you're like, this one is good to go?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes short stories surprise me because, like I said before, I do feel as though sometimes I know where I'm headed with.
Mm-hmm.
I know what I have a specific image in mind, or a scene ending, or something very specific about the conclusion of the story. I want the character to arrive at X place.
Yeah.
But sometimes they take me elsewhere.
Yeah.
Like, I'm working on a story right now that I can't, I'm having a hard time solving for, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I know the ending, but I don't know how to get them there exactly.
Interesting.
And so I think it feels complete, or it feels like it's whole, once I've really, again, kind of adhered to the authentic, voice of the narrative, or the authentic kind of trajectory, even if it's a surprising one,
Mm-hmm.
of the character. And I do realize retrospectively, like, I was talking with someone who was like, oh, I find your stories to be so, like, arresting, right? I find them to be, by the time I reach the end of the story, I almost didn't see it coming, or I feel like she used this word of being exorcised, like EXOR,
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
there's an exorcism happening. She's drawn out of the tale at the end. And I do realize, when I think with my story craft hat on, and I analyze the actual, composition of the story, and think about the craft elements of the story, that I think that may be true, because the climax, or like the turning point in the story, often comes very close to the ending.
Mm-hmm.
In
Mm.
many of my stories. And I think that, whether that's also subconscious or unintentional, all of those things, it's still true. And I'm not sure what compels me to create a story shape that's much more like that, where there's, very little denouement in a way, or
Mm-hmm.
something.
Mm-hmm.
But that feels very satisfying to me. And so I think I have to, like, as a writer, I have to feel satisfied, with the story. And I'm not actually in that moment thinking about the reader's satisfaction, or, even the characters within them's satisfaction. But, maybe that's very selfish of me, but I think that's what it is. I'm also reminded of, like, David Joust once saying to me, or saying maybe in a lecture during grad school, that he still, like, would pick up his published collections with a red pen in his hand, and have to really restrain himself from making new choices, or from, excising certain words, or revising even after they should be, by all intents and purposes, complete in a published book, right?
Yeah.
And I've had that a little bit of I understand where he's coming from a little bit in some stories sometimes. So it's hard to decide when a story's complete, but that's my best answer.
A great answer. The title of this collection, What We Might Become, I think is just so perfect. It feels both hopeful and ominous. There's this duality to it that feels just right. And so I'm curious, how did the title come about?
It really drew out of, originally, actually, in this manuscript, that I should say that it did have a different title in former iterations. It also included a story that I eventually took out of the collection, and that title had come from the story that I excluded in the final draft, and I replaced it. I replaced that story with The Dwindling, which is in the collection at the end. But once I kind of revisioned the collection and the kind of like how I wanted the arrangement of the stories to be in the holistic like vision of the collection. I think I was really consumed by what Cheryl Boyd says to to Elise, the artist, the sculptor, in the beginning of or at the end of Clay Girls, but in the beginning of the collection, she asks her like, what will I become? She's thinking about that, not in like an existential way, right? But it begs the idea of an existential question. And I think it also speaks to that potential that I talked about before, which is that we are so multidimensional as people, as mothers, as writers, as people in the world, and we contain multitudes. I really think that's true, and that is a deep fascination of mine, is all of the kind of hidden non-transparent lives that we are living all of the time, that are not visible to the outside world. And even on top of that, now that I have this book in the world, that was like a great anxiety of mine. It was like, I made this thing in private for however long it took me to write this book, a long time. Yeah. And now it's publicly available for people to consume, and I don't get to control anymore how that your impression of these fictions, but also what you are, assigning to these fictions about me, and all of these things. So I suppose when I think about it now I'm much more secure in it, because I'm confident in the content of the book, and I feel proud of the book. But that was like a huge anxiety for me, putting a private project into the public domain, and then allowing people, you don't control what they think or who reads it or what they assign to you as your own, personal themes or challenges, or if they're assigning things from the book to your personal life. But again, it's fiction. So all of those things, when it comes with like this deep well of anxiety for me, that has something to do with those multitudes also. And like that, you can also, what will I become in the context of that, to other people, in kind of like a meta way. So I'm glad you appreciate that. I was really happy with my landing spot for the title at the end.
Yeah, it's great. It's and now I love it even more hearing you talk about it. We heard in the blurbs at the beginning, talk of this. You create extremely vivid characters, and you really do let them breathe, even in a short number of pages. They just feel very knowable. How do your characters come to you?
That's a great question. I'm character rendering is like my favorite part of, and dialogue are probably my favorite, craft elements. I could do character sketches like all day, and never have to kind of create a story out of any of them.
Do you do that? Do you actually just kind of hang out sometimes?
But okay. I do have characters, for instance, that have kind of followed me around for a while that I don't have a place for yet, that are like, ripe for the picking, but not they don't have a story just yet. And so I kind of do let them kind of develop their own interior lives independent of me. And I do have confidence that they'll find a way in. But, I think really so much of writing is kind of like subconscious harvesting of so many things. And I want to allow that process to kind of be a subconscious one. I think having it remain subconscious is part of the magic and the joy of the writing. I have had like a couple folks who know me very well, like my closest friends, like a couple people who know me very well, say like, hey, you know what? This story makes me think about, do you think this story was about that? And I'm like, oh, wow. She really like psychoanalyzed that.
Yeah.
Like, really unpacked that for me in ways that I hadn't even necessarily thought about myself. Right. But those kind of like those unlived lives kind of ideas that I'm super curious about and love exploring because it gives an outlet for those things we don't yet know about ourselves and on a subconscious level. So I'm not sure how to directly answer your question. There are very like specific characters that I can point to, and I can say like I know that I kind of listened on the train. I listened very carefully on the train, and I harvested this little piece of dialogue, and it turned into this much richer character sketch of someone or something that then became a story. I like people behaving badly.
Me too.
So I do go to lots of places of like speculation, right? Around what if X, or what if I have this idea of a person, but I put them in this scenario, or I make them make this decision about something, or instead of being a traditional society's traditional expectation for an expecting mother, what if she's terrified, and what if she's reluctant, and what if she's none of the things that she's supposed to be, right? By societal norms, and figure out what that makes her do, and what that makes her think about and obsess with.
What is your process like when you kind of get that piece of found dialogue that you kind of know you want to run with, or just this sort of glimmer of where it's going to start? What happens next? How does it all evolve until you're...
I'm a singular writer. Like I cannot do more than one thing at a time. Like I cannot have multiple, so I mentioned before earlier in the interview that, that many of these were drafted over a long period of time. I drafted, so many of these stories, and then put down story writing for about like 6 years while I wrote a novel, which is at rest upstairs. Currently at rest, needs to be returned to, and I will do that because I very much believe in the project. But I couldn't write stories and a novel simultaneously. I find the novel writing to be so incredibly immersive that it would be too distracting to be working on something else. So I am very kind of focused on the solution, right? If we were talking about like the story being like a puzzle for me. Once I have a story at hand, I am really kind of ultimately obsessed with solving it until it reaches a conclusion of some kind, and then I can move on. Like I have a couple other story ideas right now in my head, but I can't even start to address them until I've worked this out, or until I've decided that I can't work this out and I need to move on. But I draft on on a laptop, in Word. If I'm in a class or teaching a class, I work in a notebook, in a journal. But for the drafting of stories, I'm very much a Word person, and I can't. Part of the delicious joy, I think, of short story writing for me is that you can be so micro about your choices of language and lyricism and images and things like that. And that's super, super important to me. And I do really futz a lot with that. And so I just feel like, a novel is too expansive I futz like in little pieces, but the novel feels too big to futz at the level I want to futz, So I spend a lot of time when I begin a story, if I have taken a day off or something like that, when I go back, I really have to start from the beginning, and I will futz all the way through until I get to where I had left off. And I don't see that as an intentional process. I see that as just like the thing that happens when I write. But I think it's better for it because I'm revising all the time. Like I'm revising every time I sit down. It's not like I can bang out a draft and then go back and bang out a new draft. It's hard for me to do that. It's hard for me to do the Lamont, like, and write a shitty first draft. Because I can't get all the way through. It's just because I haven't solved the puzzle yet. If I knew all of the things along the way, I could probably sit down and write a shitty first draft. But I don't, so I futz.
That's great. That's really interesting. And I love that. So you're sort of revising along the way, and in so doing, figuring out more of the next step to be able to. So by the time you're getting to the end, you're probably much further along, and you've got like I would assume, a pretty clean draft that's been.
I think so. And I'm not sure how common that, I think so. I'm not sure how common that is. Like I will, reach its conclusion and then, give it a day or so to breathe, go back, do like another major kind of overhaul for all the things. But then I'll like give it to a trusted reader. I'll give it to a friend for like a full draft overhaul. I don't, that's not to say, I keep a folder for every story with the title of the folder's name. And there's, probably anywhere between like 3 and 12 versions of that with a date on it, with a more updated date of that, where I'm just saving a new draft so I can go back through. And I think that happens, the more iterations of the story that there are in that folder indicate its level of imperfection on the first, second, third, and fourth pass, right? If there are 12, it was really rough to begin with. But yes, does that answer?
We talked about how several of the stories in this collection were previously published in various journals over time. Can you talk a little bit about what that process was like, the publication of the individual stories, and how you found the homes for them that you thought fit, and what the submission and publication process was like, just on the individual level?
Yeah, not for the faint of heart. Still, right? There's so much good writing happening out there, and like wonderful, beautiful journals, and literary magazines. I encourage anyone to start sending their work once they like find that their story, at least in their heart, can be at rest. Like you've got to start sending things out. I get a ton of rejections. I keep a spreadsheet where I, redline and things like that. I keep a very rigid kind of calendar of submissions. Now Submittable makes everything so much easier for submitting. But when I was first starting out, Submittable was not a thing. Read all the journals. You've got to read all the journals and make sure you know what kind of aesthetic they're going for before you're submitting there. I think that's the first a common error that people make. They're just kind of canvassing the wide world of literary journals without knowing what they do well and what they're seeking. And then, with, for instance, like the Kenyon Review, I worked very closely with their fiction editor. I did, they were I had only when I worked with the Kenyon Review, I felt as though, there was an editorial manager, there was the editorial team. I probably did another couple drafts, but it was pretty none of it was content based, right? It was like minutia, punctuation, maybe word choice here and there. And they were lovely to work with. Similarly, Waterstone. They, I think there's different kind of styles and techniques that editors are bringing to the table. It was slightly more heavy-handed in that publication, but all very, at the end of the day, you're the author, and they're at the end of the day deferential to that idea, and I appreciate that so much. But it is a long road to publication, and I haven't also been submitting individually very much in the last several years, like while I put this collection together, and I don't have something that I would be sending out in this moment until I get to the end of this story that I'm working on here, I hope. But those are very important to the publishing process overall. I think if editors at small presses and university presses, academic presses see, even if you're trying to get agented, for instance, you really have to have some previous publication experience. That's really, I think, an endorsement to your skill and your storytelling ability. And I think that's really important to have under your belt before you go out to try to get some kind of a book published. So that was certainly assisted, I think, in me finding a home in Cornerstone. So that was great.
And then you put the collection together. So how did you make the choice of what stories you wanted to? Oh, hello.
My little old dog.
Oh, how did you make the choice of what stories you wanted to include in the collection? You also mentioned that you had swapped out one, and then how to sequence them.
Oh boy, the sequencing was very challenging for me. I did kind of, there are several stories that just were too far outside of that kind of like thematic nucleus that it didn't seem like they were great choices for the collection. There was another story that had kind of surreal elements to it. I mean, there are like, there's little glimmers of things in many of the stories that have kind of a surreal aspect to them. But, there are two stories in the collection that are firmly, have a speculative bent, right? C3P Girl and The Dwindling have these, distinctly speculative qualities to them. And so did one other story that I was hoping to include in the collection. And then when I considered it as a whole, I did draw that out. And there are a couple others that maybe I wasn't satisfied with. Like maybe they weren't their best iteration yet. Maybe I'm still trying to solve that puzzle, or maybe they felt like a little quieter. Like I think, for instance, that one of the quietest stories in the collection is Sickness and Health. And recently I was asked to speak to this writing group about, they do like a short story analysis once a month. They choose a short story to read, and then as writers, they kind of unpack it as writers, right? And they were the most delightful group of folks, and that's the story they chose. And I thought that was so unusual. It felt like it wasn't, if you wanted like a story that was like doing all the things, right? That was not a story that's doing all the things. It's a very kind of subdued story. But again, they made me see that story so differently than I see it myself. So this is all to say that selecting the stories that were in it was way less challenging than sequencing them. Sequencing them was really, really a difficult task for me. So many of the stories are dark in nature, or have a kind of darkness about them. There's not a lot of like uplifting stories. And so I also didn't want it to feel like this kind of, I didn't want it to feel challenging to get through on like an emotional level.
Mm-hmm.
And yet maybe it's challenging to get through on an emotional level.
No, it's not challenging to get through on an emotional level. Well, in the best way.
Good
Challenging
answer.
emotionally in the best way.
So like I think Clay Girls is a lighter, it has like a good amount of humor to it. That first story, as does the last. And so I kind of made it like a dark sandwich, like a darkness sandwich.
Mm-hmm.
Lighter in the front, lighter in the back, and kind of all of the I ask a lot of the reader, I guess, in the middle. I ask a lot of the reader to shoulder and to think about and to come along with me in thinking about. So once I did that, and once I kind of figured out which was the first and the last, sequencing that middle section was challenging for me because I was thinking about things like narrative voice and distance and the sweep of the story and things like that. And I wanted to put one that like kind of swept in a very short period of time next to one that had kind of a more sweeping longer narrative timeline. I had to think about things like point of view and narrative distance, and I'm happy with it in the end. There are two stories that involve walking right up against one another, which I'm like, ooh, I would have maybe moved them around, but they're very different stories, so I'm happy with them. It was a real challenge, I think, for me to think of them that way. I remember a professor of mine once telling me when I was thinking about sequencing when we were studying, short story collections and things. She said something like, some people think about the table of contents like a poem. And I was like, ooh, that's an interesting way to think about. So it's like, I went through some various exercises of that kind, like where, I'm not sure that mine reads like a poem, but it was something, it was something to think about. I didn't want all of the adolescents up against one another. I didn't want all of the mothers, which is very challenging to do because there's a lot of adolescents and there's a lot of mothers in this collection. So that is that for me was a very challenging aspect of editing and putting this collection together as a whole. And I changed that several times along the way when I was in editorial with my team. I think I changed the sequence like 5 or 6 times.
Wow. Yeah. Really refining it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, what was that road to publication like for you with the collection?
Yeah. I went out years ago before I started even writing the novel with a collection that is different than this collection. It involved many of the stories in this collection, but certainly not all of them. And I went to, I was querying agents and getting feedback from them that was, or getting nothing at all, which unfortunately I feel like is so very much like the normalized in the industry, which is upsetting to me, and yet can't do anything about it. But for agents who were responding to me and giving me feedback, they would say things like, your writing is beautiful, do you have a novel? Or because selling a collection is really challenging, and they're thinking about it pragmatically from an economic perspective, and they don't make a lot of money, and I understand that question. They're also thinking about like investing in the writer as a whole in terms of her career. Does she have another book in there, right? And at the time, I didn't, and I think it was too much of a risk to take. Or they would say, your writing is beautiful. If you write a novel, come back to me and we can talk. And some talk of trying to like package those two things together in like a 2-book deal, which is certainly a bit more common for short story collections if there's another novel on the end of that. And so I put the short story collection down, and I did have a novel idea, and it's not the reason why I went and wrote a novel, but certainly when I was finished with the novel, I went back to that same group of folks who were interested in my stories and said, remember me? I have a novel now, and would you like to see it? Unfortunately, that was like in the heart of the pandemic in 2021. I finished the novel in the pandemic, and it's largely a novel about grief. And we weren't doing a lot of that then because it was not good for our collective health. And so, that was the feedback, was that I'm not sure we can spend, 18 months to 2 years on a project that's, this centered on grief as an experience. Mm-hmm. I think the pendulum has swung quite a bit. We're seeing a ton of grief work come out now, right? Mm-hmm. So I better get on it.
Yeah.
But so I had put the collection down while I wrote that novel. And then, my dear friend from grad school, we exchange work sometimes. And she was like, what's happening with the collection? And I said, I put it down. And she was like, why did you do that? I'm like, I'm still writing stories. And she was like, you really need to rethink that. Like, you should really, what have you got? I'll read the manuscript. Let's go. And I think because I had gone the traditional querying agent route at big houses, and for so long, it felt like I had heard no so long that I was like, well, that project is dead. Like, that's a dead project, and I'll concentrate more on the novel. But then she also encouraged me to go the independent press and university press route. That was really, she, felt that was a great space for specifically the work that I was doing to find a home. Mm-hmm. I reached out to like several university presses, Cornerstone among them, and they were so fast, uncharacteristically fast, with like turnaround time. I think I queried them in March, and they came back. I think I had a signed contract in May.
Wow.
So in like 2 months, I had submitted, they had offered me a contract, which was wonderful. And they have been nothing short of amazing to work with. I can't say enough good things about the university press experience there. University of Wisconsin. They have an editorial team. It's a teaching press, which is like, I kind of think about it like a teaching hospital, right? There are, graduate and undergraduate students who are learning all aspects of the publishing, from editorial to jacket design to all of those things. Underneath that, under an umbrella that's led by a like super awesome director, who's making at first pass like all of those publishing decisions, like which manuscripts they'll be taking. Made exclusively by him, right? And I didn't go into editorial until, say, right around the first of the year of 2024, and it came out October 15th. So, I had like a good amount of waiting time before I even went like from, May to January of just like, I can just write. I can write. I was off the hooks. I sent my manuscript to folks to blurb the book, but that was just a delightful way to see a book into the world. And a good friend was like, "Wow, you really you got to write the book that you wanted to write." And I, not to say that other people don't get to do that too, but outside of the context of, say, some kind of larger publishing house that is thinking about it like in the economic metrics that they need to, I got to do that. Yeah. So that was I have nothing to compare it to. It's my debut, right? But it feels really edifying for me, so I'm happy about that.
Have you always been a writer?
I am a teacher first in terms of like what has paid the bills. So I think it took me until, you know, squarely in my late 30s to call myself a writer. I'm still a little reluctant to call myself an author, but I can do that. But you know, I love to write from a really young age, and you know, decided to go to an undergraduate program that had a, you know, exceptional, you know, literary history, and that was intentional, certainly. And then when I graduated from there, I really thought to myself, ooh, it's an English major, right, with an emphasis in creative writing, which was poetry at the time, actually. So my manuscript coming out of there, it was a poetry manuscript. Hard to parlay that into like, into like some sort of lucrative, or not lucrative, just supportive stream of revenue. And so I thought I would go to California, and I worked in the entertainment industry for a while, and wanted to write for maybe film or television. That was an idea that I had, and did that for several years, but then left that work to become a high school English teacher. So I did that in Los Angeles for several years before moving back to the East Coast. And then I was a long time English teacher, you know, right up until my youngest was in second grade. And then I left that to write full time, which I wasn't doing at all after my MFA. You know, like I wasn't writing. I was writing, but I wasn't writing in a sustained capacity. And I really couldn't, because I was grading papers and lesson planning and doing all of those things. And I loved my job. I loved being, have a lot of experience with the adolescent, right?
Yeah.
Even before I had my own. But I loved that. It's just that it's really hard to do those two things simultaneously. I do think now that my kids are growing fast, that I'll return to teaching, probably not maybe at the high school level, but I'd love to go back in and, you know, teach in a grad program or something would be wonderful. Yeah. So kind of, but also a teacher.
But you were writing all along.
Yeah.
And
I mean, with big gaps in productivity.
Yeah. Which seems right. I think that sounds like the norm.
Yeah. I'm no spring chicken.
What is your best advice for aspiring authors?
I think you got to keep going. There's so much about there's so much about it that can be discouraging. It's pretty isolating. It's pretty lonely. It's pretty you know, solitary, right?
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I tend to like that part of the work. I like stowing away in my own little private space and having that time. I'm also a writer who cannot write in public spaces. I need to be like in the black box, you know, like drop down over my head. Like I can't write in a coffee shop. I can't write in a library. I really need to be in a quiet, no music. I have to be in like a quiet, private space. So figure out what works for you. Make sure you give yourself the gift of that in some amount of time or routine that you can, and keep going. Like, and however you're doing it is also like, I think writers have a tendency to doubt that what they're doing is the right thing. Like, you know, I think as a younger writer, I was always like, what's their process? What's their, you know, that maybe that would work for me. Maybe this would work for me. And the thing is that whatever works for you works for you. So there are as many different styles and types of routines and, you know, writing, excuse me, writing setups as there are writers. So, yours is no less valid than the guy next door or than any other, widely acclaimed and published author. You just have to find the thing and go into it. The thing that you can sustain. And that might be also different over, the course of your life. Like my writing time was nap time when my kids were very little and after they were in bed, because it's the only time I had. Now my kids stay up later than me.
Yeah.
But they go to school. So I have that, but it certainly changes over time. You just have to be a little bit forgiving with yourself and read everything. That's the other thing. Read everything. Read things that you don't think are your things to read too. Read all the things. Read nonfiction. Read the genre fiction that you think is distasteful. So you know how it's done, right? So you know how other people are doing it. So you can have an opinion about it. So you can adopt parts of it. So you can borrow stylistically from it. Like that's what good literature is doing these days, is like, really thinking broadly about all sorts of things. It's not kind of minimized to this little wedge of a canon, the way that it used to be, the way that I think older people like myself, grew up studying staunchly in this, very white, very old, very dead canon. But, the best writers writing now are I hope, thinking across all sorts of genres and things. Some of the best books I've read recently are doing that thoughtfully and well. So read everything.
Love that. Do you have specific books in mind?
When I say that?
Yeah.
I will say that one of the books that shocked me that I loved was Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. Gabrielle Zbin. I think she has written maybe YA or her other novels, which I was not familiar with, were primarily YA, and then she wrote this novel that blew my mind. I just wouldn't have ever picked up a novel about video games. It's not my jam. And manages to world build in a way that is clearly borrowing from all sorts of other places, science fiction, and doing it really thoughtfully and beautifully and lyrically and in a literary way.
Yeah, that one's been on my list for a while. You've encouraged me to pull it off the list and read it.
Yeah.
Traditional last question that we have on this podcast has to do with music, actually. So What We Might Become, or one of the stories inside, take your pick, is made into a movie or series, what do you think the theme song should be?
Maybe Led Zeppelin's Your Time Is Gonna Come. I would have a really good time with the playlist, I think. I have a friend who was doing that for her own book, and she was taking suggestions on social media, and I was like, oh, that's a good way to do it. Crowdsource it.
Yeah. So we'll have a whole soundtrack.
Yeah, there you go. I love it. Yeah.
Sara Reish Desmond, thank you so much for joining today. It's
been my pleasure.
Been great talking with you.
Thank you so much, Kelley. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you. I appreciate how thoughtful and interesting and inspiring your questions are.
Thanks for joining us on Literary Prospects. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. We'll see you next time.